Hello everybody, Professor Barth is here. Inflation USA, Inflation Nation, Biden inflation, whatever you want to call it. That's what we're covering in this video, the current state of the United States dollar. Big topic, heavy topic. As many of you are aware, I have a whole course on the history of money that I recorded last fall. What are my thoughts on the current inflation? A lot going on. In this video, I've broken it down into 4 parts. We're going to take a look at prices today in 2021. Part B, we're going to look at the blame game. Who and what is to blame? There's a lot of blame shifting going around. We'll look at that in Part B. Part C, and I'm going to timestamp all this if you want to skip ahead. Part C, I'll give you my view of what the solutions to this burgeoning crisis are. And for Part D, we will take a look at the implications of inflation for the dollar as the predominant world reserve currency. So, as everyone is aware, inflation is in the news. What is inflation? Inflation is when the purchasing power of a particular currency erodes over time, and it can happen rapidly, it can happen gradually. And right now, the inflation rate is higher than it's been in a few decades. The CPI, which is a consumer price index, is a weighted average of the prices of various consumer goods and services. The CPI rose 5.4% in September, and the CPI has been above 5% since the late spring. Now, this is quite an embarrassment for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve back in January of this year, January 2021, predicted an inflation rate of 1.8%. Now, the Fed doesn't use the CPI. The Fed stopped using the CPI back in 2000. They switched over to a different index, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index. It's usually a little lower than the CPI. But regardless, the Fed said 1.8% inflation rate was their forecast, and that's not how it's turning out. Janet Yellen, former Fed chair and now the Treasury Secretary, back in June, when talk of inflation really began to ramp up, Secretary Yellen assured the American people, oh, this is transitory. And that became sort of the buzzword, transitory, transitory, transitory. Biden said it, Yellen said it, Jerome Powell said it. We'll take a look at Powell in a little bit. Now, so here she is. This is in June. U.S. Treasury's Yellen tells the G7 to keep spending, says inflation will pass. And that's when she used the if you read further in the article, the word transitory. Well, now, just a couple days ago, Janet Yellen came out and said, actually, expect inflation to remain quite high through until at least the second half of 2022. So we can expect now, according to Yellen, inflation at least until the summer of 2022. Quite a different story. That's not so transitory. Now, as we'll see in this video, unless extraordinary steps are taken, I can assure you that inflation will persist beyond summer 2022, or at least that is how I see it. But the forecasts are changing now. Yellen expects high inflation through mid-2022. So let's take a look at the data today, right now, the state of the U.S. dollar before we speculate about the future. Here's CPI data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Bureau of Labor Statistics is the agency that computes the CPI. And you look here, this is where the 5.4% increase. Here's a little graphic. This might have been from the Wall Street Journal. I should have gone back and double-checked. But this analyst for an equity research company studied prices at Dollar General and Family Dollar stores across the country, and and compared prices between 2020 and 2021. It's quite illuminating. 12-pack of Pepsi. Last year, $3.33. Today, $5.95. Dozen eggs, $1.25, now $1.50. Pringles can, Pop-Tarts. Folgers ground coffee. Cream cheese. And body wash was $6.75, now $7.50. And you might look at these prices and snicker a bit, like, oh, who cares, you know? A quarter here, 50 cents there, $1.50 there. This adds up. This adds up. Especially for working families who are already, as it were, in 2020, living paycheck to paycheck. Now, when everything in your grocery cart is going up, 50 cents, 75 cents, $1, $2, that leads to a significantly higher bill. Look at these numbers. Ground beef, up. Chicken breast, up. That's quite a jump there, actually. Almost $1. Gallon of whole milk, up almost 60 cents. This is from the Seattle Times yesterday. This year's Thanksgiving feast will wallop the wallet. Thanksgiving 2021 could be the most expensive meal in the history of the holiday. And here's some other stats. These are prices from, some of these are like quite astounding, actually. From the end of 2021, from the end of 2020 through today. Price of lumber up 23% since the latter months of 2020. 23%. Home prices, 15%. Washing machines, 30%. Furniture, up 11%. Used cars, up 33%. My wife and I had to upgrade to a van back in May of this year, and it was hard to find a used car, okay? Or at least a used car that was within our budget. We had to adjust our budget a bit. Used cars up 33%. Gasoline up 43%. It's up more than $1 a gallon here in Tempe. Ground beef up 14%. Makes a difference in the pocketbook of a working class American. Pork up 12%. Poultry 7%. Eggs 11%. Steak up 20%. Bacon up 25%. Every year, Social Security does a cost of living adjustment to adjust for inflation. They announced recently that the cost of living adjustment will be 5.9%. That is the highest increase in the Social Security cost of living adjustment since 1983. That's before yours truly was born. I wasn't even born when the last time the Social Security had a larger cost of living adjustment. Okay? Last year, for the present year, what was announced last year, the adjustment was only 1.3%. So 5.9%, that's a huge adjustment. The U.S. government announced that they expect heating bills to go up 54% in this upcoming winter. 54% increase in heating bills in this upcoming winter. And according to Moody's Analytics, on average, and this is where I said, some people snicker, just a quarter here, 50 cents there. What does that really matter? Well, when you add it up, Moody's Analytics recently studied this and found that American families are today paying, on average, an additional $175 a month on food, fuel, and housing. That's, $175 a month. That's like a full grocery bill if you have a large family, 2 grocery bills if you have a small family. So now all of these, when you look at price increases for certain items, there are lots of different factors at play depending on the item or depending on the service, okay? But what's undeniable is that there is a general trend, and the general trend points to something bigger, and that is a crisis of confidence in the U.S. dollar. Kimberly-Clark, major manufacturer, has announced that expect price increases for diapers, tissues, toilet paper. And so what this does, this is a tax on the American people. Political cartoon here. The inflation tax. There's inflation, grabbing the gentleman's wallet. You don't mind if I help myself to a little of your limited buying power, do you? And see, what happens is that inflation is sometimes it's called a hidden tax, but I'll tell you what, when you see the prices jump, it's not so hidden. Okay, but it's called a hidden tax because with an actual tax, a government tax is you have to pay up, and you see it, right? It's a lot more tangible, I guess is a way to describe it. It's a lot more direct. Okay, maybe that's a better way to describe it. Direct taxation. Whereas inflation, it's just sort of this, it's hidden in the sense of, you're not paying the government. The government or the central bank, we'll see that in a minute, has devalued your currency, and your currency now has less purchasing power. And so, it's in effect a tax. And the thing about the inflation tax hits working families, lower income and lower middle income families more than anybody else. That's who inflation targets. The working class hold a greater percentage of their assets in cash, a greater share of their assets in cash than other parts of the population who might hold many of their assets in land or securities, investments, and assets that are largely immune to inflation. That, because as inflation rises, the Dow Jones is going to go up. Okay, the Dow Jones will go up. Actually, the Dow Jones is up 28% since last October. Okay, Dow Jones is up 28% since last October. But for working families, those rising price levels make a real difference. And one of the reasons behind that is that wages and income, again, especially for working families, do not rise proportionally to the inflation rate. So the inflation rate is always at least a little higher than wage growth or income growth. Obviously, another group that suffers from inflation are those who save and retirees. Retirees in particular have a lot of savings. Those savings get wiped out by inflation, and surveys show that the elderly Americans are quite concerned about the future value of their savings and their assets. Who benefits from inflation? Well, if you're in a ton of debt, that might help you out. At what cost? A crumbling economy, but your debt now in real terms is less because the dollar's been devalued. But it's not just that group. It's certain banks, certain investors. It could possibly benefit the stock market. The stock market's up 28% in the last year. It's at like almost $36,000 now. It was $28,000 last October. The share price of Google's parent company, Alphabet, is up more than double from this time last year. That's an increase of more than 100%. Amazon stock is up more than triple since the pandemic. Now, a lot of that, of course, has to do with the pandemic, which just created this demand for online shopping. But a lot of that, too, also is all this new, all the money in circulation has benefited Amazon. So speculators in real estate benefit. Financial institutions that are heavily leveraged may also benefit from deflation. And so there are winners. The point is there are winners and there are losers in a deflation scenario. But the working class undoubtedly suffers. And this was in the news not too long ago. I think it was in September. Dollar Tree, which was the last truly dollar store where the items actually are $1 and less, announced that they're no longer going to be able to maintain that dollar standard, and they had to raise prices to $1.25, $1.50. And again, you get this almost elitism, pretentiousness from the intelligentsia or the upper classes who will hear a story about that, like, oh, Dollar Tree had to raise their prices to $1.50, and they look down on that and chuckle, as as if almost a let them eat cake attitude. That has a real impact on people who are struggling. Has a real impact. It's a tax. So when the president says, I'm not raising taxes on people who are making less than $400,000 a year, that is not true. That is not true. Inflation is a tax, and it's a regressive tax. It's not just a tax, it's a regressive tax, meaning it has a disproportionately harmful impact on working people. Do you understand that? A disproportionately harmful impact on working people. It is a regressive tax. And I don't understand. I think for a lot of Democrats, they don't even quite understand it or something, because inflation is the most regressive tax you can really have. And it has again, it has quite harmful impact on ordinary Americans. For wealthy Americans or for upper middle income Americans, they can survive this fine. Okay, it's not a big deal. A lot of Americans, that's not the case. Okay, take a look at this. Okay, you want to look at the erosion of purchasing power over time. Take a look at this stat. This is median income in the United States. So average income in the United States from 2000 to 2021. Now in the year 2000, median income was $31,274. Today, in 2021, median income is $35,682. Oh, income's increased. Not so fast. If you adjust for inflation, since the year 2000, the CPI inflation measured by CPI, the dollar has inflated by 60%. 60%. If you adjust for inflation, and we'll use the year 2000 as the base. So for that's the median income 2000. We'll use that as a base. So that's in real dollars. We'll say that it's still the same because that's the base. In 2021, if you adjust for inflation, median income is $22,399. That is a decline of 28% in median income in this country. All right? You see what's happening there. The loser. Median income. The loser of inflation. Okay, well, let's look at this stat. In the year 2000, the median price of a home was $167,329. So in 2000, on average, you made $31,000 a year, and your house, new home, cost you $167,000. Today, in 2021, median price of a home is $368,575. That's a lot. But, let's adjust for inflation. There's been inflation, so let's adjust. Using year 2000 as base, like the previous slide. If we use that as the base in 2021, it's still a lot higher than in 2000. In $2,000, in the year 2000, the median home price in the U.S. today is $231,375. That is an increase of 38%. So think about, to say it differently, median income down in the United States by 28% in the last 2 decades. The cost of a home up 38% in real terms. All right, and then we wonder why movements like Occupy Wall Street, or why like the young people start getting attached to democratic, what they call democratic socialism. I addressed communism in the last video, or a couple of videos back. So you know my opinion on that. I'm not down with that. But this is the world that the people who are attached to those movements are going up in. And I'll do one more stat and then we'll move on. Okay. Pound of ground beef. In the year 2000, pound of ground beef on average was $1.63. Man, that's cheap. What we're used to today, right? Man, $1.63, that's nice. To give you a little perspective, in 2008, it was still only $2.41. That's, man, 2008 for me feels like almost like a few weeks ago or something, okay? Today, the average price of a pound of ground beef is $4.47. Let's adjust this for real dollars. In terms of real dollars, will you use year 2000 as base? That is an increase in real terms of 72%. 72%. So the price of ground beef in real terms has increased by 72% in the U.S. in the last 2 decades. So your income's down in real terms. Housing is up significantly in real terms. And the cost of your food, in this case ground beef, is up in real terms. So, we have what psychologists call normalcy bias. We just assume, okay, I've never experienced, I've always, through my whole life, it's been gradual inflation. Okay, gradual inflation. The Fed has this mandate, this target inflation rate of 2%, which I think is foolhardy. Why 2%? But putting that aside, that's a different topic. Generally, the Fed's been around that, with exceptions here and there. People who were born since the boomers, they have not experienced meaningful inflation. Okay. The older generation, they remember inflation. Let me give you all a little reminder. This is a inflation chart from the 1970s. Look at that. In 73 to 74, inflation hit double digits. Okay, we're still at 5.4% right now. The weighted average hit double digits, 10%. Went down a little bit when the Fed raised interest rates, and then shot up and hit a peak in March of 1980 of 14.8%. Almost 15% inflation in the spring of 1980. Economic historians call this stagflation because you had inflation with unemployment. Unemployment quite higher than average, and in the early 1980s went into the double digits. So it's happened before, inflation of double-digit inflation, and we are not immune from that happening again, and there's nothing saying it can't be worse than that. Things could get worse, especially if extraordinary measures are not taken. Later in this video, we'll look at the extraordinary measures that were taken to stop the 1970s inflation, and I have my doubts that the United States today has the political will to do what they did in the late 70s and the early 80s to stop the inflation. I'm not sure we have the political will to do it like they did back then. We'll get to that in a moment, but this has happened before in the memory of living Americans today, and it can happen again, and it can be worse than that. We hope it's not, but I'm telling you right now, the signs don't look so good. So who and what is to blame? We're in part B of this video. Now, speaking of the 1970s, when the inflation was spinning out of control, the government wanted to blame everybody except themselves. Didn't want to blame themselves, didn't want to blame the Federal Reserve. Okay. The inflation of the 1970s, Nixon, Carter blamed it on oil prices and currency speculators. When Nixon got the U.S. off the gold standard on August 15th, 1971, he blamed the speculators, the currency speculators. They blamed greedy businessmen, greedy union leaders. But we know now, and historians, there's a broad consensus that monetary policies and large federal budget deficits were the root cause of that inflation. And today we have more blame shifting. More blame shifting. There's a lot of talk right now about the supply chain, the bottlenecks that in our ports, our highways, our railways, our warehouses. And it's a real issue. Undoubtedly, there are major supply chain issues. Not denying the existence of a supply chain problem. It's really bad. Now, the administration would have you think it's just purely because of pent-up consumer demand, and that, since the pandemic, we're essentially out of the pandemic now. You have a lot of phobic people out there wanting it to continue, but we're putting that aside. It's true that pent-up consumer demand is partly responsible. But another factor here are labor shortages in our ports and warehouses and trucking. Labor shortages have played a really big role in the supply chain issue. And not just in the supply chain, but all across the board. And this is how you know that there's something bigger going on. Labor shortages, people are being driven out of the workforce. There's a lot of questions why. I think the vaccine mandates play a huge role in that. It's causing a lot of people to retire early. That, together with unprecedented government stimulus checks since the pandemic. In September last month, 4.3 million people walked off the job. The labor shortage, and you see it everywhere. I mean, you can't go to a restaurant, food service industry without seeing it. They're begging for workers. Meat processing plants, that all contributes to the price increase in meat. Staffing and labor shortages there. Shortages in skilled labor, hospital workers, airline pilots, Southwest Airlines, school teachers, tech workers, all right, you name it. But the mandate has played a huge role. This was the American Trucking Association's the CEO. ATA, its members and our drivers, the truckers. So you want to talk about the supply chain. Its members and our drivers remain committed to delivering life-saving COVID vaccines, but these proposed requirements, however well-intentioned, threaten to cause further disruptions throughout the supply chain, impeding our nation's COVID response efforts and putting the brakes on any economic revival. The September jobs report was abysmal. They were expecting about 500,000 jobs, which itself isn't very good considering we're getting out of a pandemic where GDP just crashed to the ground, and you would expect more job growth, and even 500,000 jobs couldn't even reach that. Only 194,000 jobs were added in September, and on top of that, the total size of the labor force, the employed and also those who are actively seeking employment, fell by 183,000. So it was basically just nil. All right, and again, why is that? People are just leaving the workforce, retiring early or whatever. They're not working. In fact, actually, Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that there are more than 10 million job openings right now in the U.S. 10 million job openings and about 8 million unemployed. So there's 2 million more job openings than there are unemployed. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so my point. There are major supply chain issues. The causes are several. Okay. Yeah, pent-up consumer demand, but also labor shortages. Labor shortages are very, very real. They're causing prices to go up. Supply chain is causing prices to go up. So yes, those two things have played a role. But at the end of the day, it's the Fed, stupid. Okay, that old saying from the 90s where for Clinton's campaign, The thing he wanted to drill into the voters' head is the economy, stupid. It's the Fed. It's the Fed. You want to understand inflation? Yeah, talk about supply chain. That's fine. Talk about the labor shortages. That's fine. But at the end of the day, who's issuing the dang money? I look at my currency there, and I see Federal Reserve note. Well, Federal Reserve note. Well, maybe the Federal Reserve has something to do with the inflation. You would think that's just a no-brainer, but you watch the news and just you would just think it's all supply chain, it's all labor shortages. No, the Fed has played a major role, and not just a major role, but the predominant role in this devaluation of the U.S. dollar. Make no mistake about it. It's the Fed. Now, look at this chart. This is an astounding chart. Now, defenders of the Fed here would say, whoa, they had to do this because of the pandemic. But these are assets, the Fed's assets. So the Federal Reserve has all these assets. Before 2008 financial crisis, they only had about $1 trillion of assets. Then 2008 had a major jump with quantitative easing. Began buying up mortgage-backed securities. I'm not going to get into all the... If you want to know more about the Federal Reserve, I've got videos on that. But in March of 2020, through that early part of the summer, major spike, almost $3 trillion spike in the Federal Reserve's total assets on their balance sheet. Bonds and mortgage-backed securities, owing to quantitative easing. Get to that in a moment. And then, together with this, quantitative easing, where the Fed created new money. They didn't even really print it. Sometimes you'll hear, the Fed's printing money. Most of the time, they're not printing money. Most of the time, it's just adding zeros to the accounts of different banks. But huge jump in the balance sheet through new rounds of QE, quantitative easing, and then the federal funds rate was slashed. Finally, after years of near 0% interest rates, the Fed began in 2016 to bring things up. They needed to. That was long delayed. Got up to 2.5%. Started taking it down a little bit, and then COVID, and just crashed right back down. So we have near zero interest rates. By the way, if you want a picture of the Fed's interest rates, which is called the federal funds rate, historically, look at, here's after 2008, near zero interest rates, climbed up barely. Look at, even that is, from a historical standpoint, very, very low, 2.5%, and then brought down. Now we're back down to zero. These are historically low interest rates that we've had in this country since the 2008 crisis. Like, we've never seen anything like this before. These low interest rates, near zero interest rates. We don't know yet the long-term impact of all of that. I think we're beginning to figure it out now. This is not sustainable much longer. You cannot keep interest rates this low, combined with all this quantitative easing, so-called, and the increase you see here in the Fed's balance sheet. Every month, the Fed has a bond buying program of $120 billion a month that they're creating out of thin air to purchase treasury bills. That's adding $120 billion every month to the Fed's balance sheet. You cannot, there's quantitative easing, you cannot continue that without some kind of major repercussion for the value of your currency. So yes, what the Fed does, it creates these new currency units, injects them into the economy by buying treasury bonds, by buying mortgage-backed securities. This is called quantitative easing, QE. $120 billion a month. And then this was more than even that. Look at that. That's like almost $3 trillion And then after that, bam, 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 $120 billion a month with zero interest, with 0% interest rates. Again, how could you look at the inflation right now and not conclude that ultimately it's the Federal Reserve? It astounds me. And it's not just the general public, economists like you will deny this. Jerome Powell, as we'll see in a moment, denies this. The Fed chair denies any responsibility at all for the inflation. It's not his fault. Fed policy has nothing. This has nothing to do with the inflation. This has nothing to do at all with it, they say. $120 billion monthly stimulus. Oh, stocks rallied. Stocks rallied in September when the Fed announced that they're sticking to that, quote, stimulus. $120 billion. Again, just new currency units created out of nothing. Every month. Bam, 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 bam. Buying treasury bonds. Stocks rallied. Remember I said there are winners and losers? There are people who will benefit from this inflation. And the overall effect of all of this, the QE, the interest rate, the overall effect is a major increase in the overall money supply. So there are different ways to measure the money supply. M2 is the most common measure. There are broader measures, there are narrower measures, but this is M2 over the last 20 years or so. And what this means, in the early 2000s, there were about $5 trillion. Our money supply, according to this measure, M2, which is what the Fed uses. In fact, all these charts, when you see that Fred, that's from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. So these are Fed stats, the real deal. In the early 2000s, the money supply was about $5 trillion. By 2010, we're looking at about $8 trillion. And steady, look at that increase over the 2010s. And then look at that. That's COVID. Bam! How big of an increase is that? I'm looking at it's like $15 trillion to almost to $21 trillion. Historic, okay. And again, how could you look at this graph and not conclude, maybe the inflation has something to do with the growth of the money supply? I just love the gaslighting. Like, Jen Psaki knows this. How does she not know this? Like, you'd have to be pretty, pretty ignorant, I don't know. I mean, some of this is inexplicable. But, yeah, here's if you want to see the numbers. M2 in January 2001 was $5 trillion. So M2, the money supply in February of 2020, which again was like yesterday, $15 trillion. Today, M2 is $21 trillion. That's, what? I'm not good at math. I'd have to do it in my head. That's what, like a 30% increase? 30 or 40% increase? Someone will call me out in the comments for doing bad math, but I'm doing it all in my head. That's got to be like 30, 40% increase in the money supply since the eve of COVID. I'm sorry, that's going to have an impact on the value of the dollar. Call me a radical or something for thinking that. And we know that that there is a strong correlation between M2 and inflation. This is a chart of M2 and inflation. M2 is in the black and inflation is in the red. This is since World War II. And by the way, you'll notice. Okay, I was a little off there. 25% increase. You'll notice that the growth in M2 is the highest it's been since, I think, probably since World War I. Okay, because this doesn't go that far back. It's higher than it was in 1943, which was pretty high. And then look at the inflation that followed. See, inflation, there's always a time lag between monetary growth and inflation. They don't happen at the same time. Look at the lag there. It's not a perfect correlation because there's other factors that go into inflation. If you watch my History of Money lectures, when we looked at the price revolution, when all that new gold and silver came to Europe from the Americas in the 1500s, in the 16th, 17th century, there was a lot of inflation in Europe. Prices went through the roof. And some economic historians have said, well, population was rising. And because population was rising, there was more demand and all. And that's all true. Like, that played a role. But at the end of the day, like, it's because you just had just tons and tons and tons of gold and silver coming from the Americas to Europe. And in the same way here, yeah, are there other factors at play? Yes, there are. But at the end of the day, it's the money supply. And I look at this chart, and the future of this red line, see, I'm a Christian man, so I don't let fear rule me. I would say it scares me, but God's in command. Okay. Nevertheless, the future of that red line, we'll say it alarms me a little bit, the prospects of that, because I'm looking at that. We do not know yet the impact of all of this. We do not yet know the impact of all of this. And I suspect that this line isn't going to stay all nice and calm in the early 2020s. Man, I'm like working myself up here. Like, you know. Carl Icahn, I think I'm pronouncing that right, well-known investor, billionaire, said last week, I think it was, he sees a market crisis brewing, excessive money printing. See, he sees it. The big players, they know what's responsible for us. Yeah, you got all those other factors at play, but at the end of the day, excessive money printing, not literal printing, sometimes literal printing, but excessive money creation, we'll say, by the Fed is to blame for this high inflation. He says he thinks crypto could be valuable if inflation runs rampant. Get to that a little later in this talk. Jerome Powell is in denial, like an ostrich with his head in the sand. Jerome Powell, who through the summer said transitory. Then at the end of September, so like a month ago, Powell said, well, inflation could be prolonged into early 2022. And I remember when he said, I'm like, are you kidding me? Like early 2022. Like this is going beyond early 2022. And now they're saying, well, it'll go through the summer. But he said, early 2022. And he said, after early 2022, the labor shortages, the supply bottlenecks, those will ease and things will go back to normal. And he said, and everyone needs to write this down, save it, and go search online. This quote. He's forecasted that inflation will slow down to 2.2% by the end of 2022. 2.2% by the end of 2022. Now, if that's the case, like I'll tell y'all right now, I'll put my word, give you my word. If inflation goes within a percentage point of that, 2.2%, I will make a video in November, December 2022, admitting how wrong I was about what I'm talking about here. That ain't happening though. Okay, I don't know. Barring, and this is the exception, and so if it happens, if it happens for the reason I'm stating, it'll vindicate me in some ways. But barring extreme action, and even then, I'm not sure you could get it down to only 2.2 by the end of 2022. We'll see. So that's his prediction. He was asked in September, is the Fed contributing to this problem by keeping interest rates near zero and by buying $120 billion of bonds and securities every month. And Powell said, no. And then, see, he revises his forecast. Then, a few days ago, Powell admitted, like Yellen, yes, inflation will continue into the middle to late next year. But he still said it's a supply chain. But this was the big news a couple days ago. He signaled that the Fed will begin tapering asset purchases. Tapering asset purchases. And you've heard this a lot. What does tapering mean? What does that, when you hear, oh, the Fed's going to begin tapering, what does that mean? What that means is this. They're going to start bringing this down. Tapering is right now it's $120 billion a month. Unprecedented QE, okay? Some people call it QE infinity. $120 billion a month. Tapering is reducing that amount. Okay? Now, the Fed has been talking about tapering for practically all year. Back in April, they said, tapering's right around the corner. Never happened. In summer, tapering's right around the corner. Didn't happen. I think at the next FOMC meeting, Federal Open Market Committee, I think at the next FOMC meeting, which is on November 2nd and November 3rd, I would be surprised if they did not reduce that amount. They're hyping that a bit. They probably will taper a little bit. What they need to do is to end it completely, the QE, that is. That's what they need to do. I would be shocked if they just ended it. They're not going to do that. Tapering means reducing. So we'll probably see a slight reduction in these monthly bond purchases. But, so that's the QE. But Powell, in that same interview a couple days ago, while he said, tapering is probably likely, expect something on that account, but he said rates are going to remain where they are. Okay? Maybe next year, he said. Maybe in 2022, we'll have some minor rate hikes. And whenever the Fed, minus like this, drop here, whenever Fed changes its target rate, it's usually by about a quarter at a time. So this will remain the same. There will be no announcement next week. In early November, there will be no announcement about a rate hike. Rate hikes aren't happening. What you'll see is a slight reduction in bond purchases. Powell says inflation risks are rising, but Fed can be patient. He said we can be patient. Again, he means just a slight tapering of QE, and then we'll leave interest rates where they are. Maybe we'll raise them a little bit next year. Powell is very wrong about this. Now, the other thing, the other issue here is federal spending. Federal spending. National debt, and it's actually higher than this right now. This is a slightly older chart, although it goes into 2021. National debt right now is approaching $30 trillion. $30 trillion. Here's another. There we go. Here's a chart of the federal debt. Its growth over time. Approaching $30 trillion. That's almost $90,000 per citizen. Or if you do it per taxpayer, that's $230,000 per taxpayer. Now you'll see why all this is important in just a moment. By the way, look at that spike in the federal debt. So we saw a spike in M2. And we saw with COVID, and we saw a spike here in the national debt. And if you go back to my coronavirus video in November 2020, I just remember this. I had a section on there talking about this, saying inflation's coming because of the Fed's unprecedented actions in 2020. Like I'll link to it on the in this video. But I said that explicitly that I was saying that we don't know the impact of all this growth in the money supply is going to lead to inflation. I said that was one of the consequences of all this coronaphobia going around. And now the chickens are coming home to roost, and it's the beginning. The Bible would say it's the birthing pains, okay? But look at that increase there in the debt. Big increase in the debt. That's going to have consequences, because when you measure the debt, very important metric here, the debt to GDP ratio, which used to be 40 to 60%. Look at that. Before 2008, man, this is such an alarming chart. Before 2000, it's like I love this country, man. I want to see the United States like thrive in the 21st century. I have kids. I want to see my kids in a country that's doing well. And when I see charts like this, it really makes my blood boil a little bit, because I'm like, what are we doing to this country, this beautiful country that we've inherited? Look at the debt to GDP ratio, which is a metric that very important. So like with the European debt crisis, you always heard about Italy and Greece. Their debt to GDP ratio was so high. They had borrowed too much money and they couldn't support it anymore. And that's what caused the European debt crisis. And we're at that level now. But before 2008, the debt to GDP ratio was between 40 or 30 and 60%. And that was a pretty comfortable range. And then 2008 happened. Huge spike in the debt to GDP ratio. So it's already, Trump didn't do anything Trump and the Republicans didn't do anything to stop it when the Republicans controlled Congress, or when Trump was in the White House. They didn't do anything to stop it. It was still super high in the late 2010s. So it's already high on the eve of COVID. It was already way too high. Like dangerously high. And then COVID, and boom. Right now, our debt to GDP ratio is where Italy and Greece were in the late 2000s and early 2010s. All right? Now, unlike Italy and Greece, the U.S. share of world GDP is 25%, approximately. Okay, so that's a big difference. Okay, Italy and Greece, they're not even on the map there. So we have this huge economy, and we have, I used to just say blanketly, the most powerful military in the world, but maybe that's in question a little bit. We're up there, okay, as far as military power, and then economic power, right? We're right up there at the top. So, I guess the theory is, we can handle debt to GDP like this high. Call me skeptical, okay? Now, one reason why the debt has exploded is because Treasury bond, the yield is so low right now. Historically low. Bond yields, the 10-year T-bill right now is only 1.5%, and it used to average, again, until like the 2000s, it used to average between 5 and 8%. 5 and 8%. Now it's 1.5%. Very, very, very low. And the reason for this is quantitative easing. When the Fed, when the Fed creates this $120 billion a month, what are they doing with that newly created money? A great bulk of it, most of it, is going to buy U.S. debt. Is buying, are purchasing T-bills, and that's driving the price down, which also lowers the cost for the federal government to borrow. So the cost of borrowing for the federal government is artificially lowered by QE, which creates moral hazard. Because usually, the discipline for a government comes in the form of higher interest rates. If a government begins borrowing too much, more than it can handle, the higher interest rates will result, and then will enact some discipline on that federal government, because they're going to think they're going to think twice before they before they embark on a whole lot of deficit spending because it's expensive. But when you have the Fed in there as the buyer, as the bond buyer of last resort, and they're just going to purchase an unlimited amount of government, basically unlimited amount of government securities on demand, what you're going to get, super low bond yields, and then extremely high federal debt, super high debt to GDP ratio. Okay, see how it all ties together. All ties together. The spending and the Fed, this deficit spending from the federal government, and the Federal Reserve, which enables it. See, the Federal Reserve is almost like the guy at the party who brings the liquor to the party, and the federal government is just getting drunk. Congress is drunk out of its mind. But they're enabled by the Fed. The Fed's the one who brought the liquor to the party, okay? And the liquor is making the federal government do really stupid things. The debt's going out of control, which is threatening to undermine, or not threatening to undermine, is undermining. What is our U.S. dollar backed by? Our U.S. dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. So it's not backed by gold anymore. The gold's gone, all right? Full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Well, what the heck does that mean? Is this the full faith and credit of the U.S. government? So the Fed's getting the government all liquored up. People around the world are noticing this. It's undermining trust in the federal government, and then all this, just the money supplies is going through the roof. And then administration officials go on TV and they're like, "Oh, the inflation is just transitory. It's the supply chain." Man, it's not the. This is a big. We've got big problems here. Okay, this is a big problem. Now, Biden will. The fact of the matter is, Biden's going to get the bulk of the blame for these economic woes. That's just how politics works. Whoever's in office, if an economic downturn or bad inflation, he's going to get the blame, and he should to a large degree. These the reconciliation bill, the $3.5 trillion, really boondoggle is the best way to describe it. The $1.5 trillion quote infrastructure bill. These bills are just further exploding the national debt, further undermining confidence in the U.S. credit, and is just feeding into this. Okay, and so he should get, as leader of his party, I guess. Although you have to wonder, as the figure representative of his party, he's going to get the blame. Okay, he's going to get, by the public, he's going to get the blame. It's not entirely fair though. Okay, like I said, okay, yeah, this guy, sure, but who brought the liquor to the party? All right, who brought the liquor to the party? But the public is going to blame Biden. And actually, Quinnipiac, which is mostly a left-leaning poll, so it's not some right-wing poll, found in October, so earlier this month, found that only 29% of the public believe that the economy is in either good or excellent condition, which is down from last spring. And then you get quotes like this, which are going to be rerun over and over. This was in July. Biden was asked about inflation. He said, "We know that as our economy has come roaring back, we've seen some price increases. Some folks have raised worries. This could be a sign of persistent inflation. But that's not our view. Our experts believe, and the data shows, that most of the price increases we've seen are expected to be temporary." So he's sort of wedded himself to this forecast, this view. Now, I want to be clear. My administration understands that if we were to ever experience unchecked inflation over the long term, that would pose real challenges to our economy. So while we're confident that isn't what we are seeing today, we're going to remain vigilant about any response that is needed. But again, This man does not, and the people surrounding him do not have the political will to do what is needed if inflation really does start to go up. And I mean, like hitting double digits, like 10%. There's no political will in this administration. Or to be fair, if a Republican was in office, there's no political will there to do it, because the short-term consequences to do what is needed to check inflation would bring all sorts of new problems to the tables, and that's the next part. Part C, solutions to the crisis. What do we do to save the dollar with all this going on? What do we do? 3 things. First, you have to have a major reduction in federal deficits. So the deficit spending must be majorly reduced. Now, how do you reduce the deficit? 2 ways. You could either reduce federal spending, and not just a little bit, like pretty majorly. Okay, already in 2021, the federal government has spent more money than in 2018 and 2019 combined. So you've got to have major reduction in federal spending or major tax increases. And those tax increases are not just going to be on the wealthy. It's not just the wealthy who would have to see tax increases. You would have to see major tax increases to bring this deficit down, to get the debt to GDP ratio and all that, our nation's finances in some sort of semblance of order and sanity. You would have to raise taxes if you want to keep federal spending at these extraordinarily high levels, and expand it, apparently, is what a lot of people would like to do. Then you would have to majorly increase taxes. Are you ready for that? And not just on the wealthy. Like, I'm talking middle class. You look at Europe with the sort of the entitlement society and the sort of welfare states over in Europe. The middle classes are taxed pretty heavily, a lot heavier than ours. So you'd have to see that happen in the United States. Good luck selling that. So what you really need to do is you need to reduce the spending, and you need to reduce it quite drastically. That's the first thing. The second thing, we've got to end the QE, end all this, the bond buying program. It's got to end. It's enabling this deficit spending. It's monetizing the debt monetization. Monetizing the debt is when government, instead of borrowing from private investors, from private buyers of the public debt, the government will borrow from the central bank, who just creates the money out of nothing and expands the money supply. That's called debt monetization. And debt monetization historically leads to inflation. It leads to a decline in confidence in that currency unit. But we've got to put an end to that completely, not taper it, just end it. And then we've got to see increases in the federal funds rate. Now, if I want to get more like philosophical and long term, I think we got to end it. We got to end the Federal Reserve and replace it with something better. That's a whole different video. So what I'm talking about, I don't want the Federal Reserve doing any of it. I don't want them in charge of our monetary policy for many, many reasons. I explain a lot of this in other videos, so I'm not going to go into detail here. So I'm an end the Fed guy, okay? But so what I'm talking about here is operating under the assumption that the Fed's still doing its thing. It's still, in operation. It's still in charge of our currency. With that assumption, then you better end the QE, and you better increase those interest rates. And so you want to know how this was ended? How did this story end up? Did it inflate further? Because it could have. The dollar could have inflated even further than this. Paul Volcker, who became Fed chair in 1979, rose interest rates, which were already pretty high. I mean, they got low. Look how low they were in the early 70s. That contributed to double-digit inflation, so they hiked up rates. Then inflation kind of went down again, so they responded by lowering rates. down below 5%. And then when inflation ramped up, the Fed had to hike interest rates. And look at how high the interest rate got. It peaked in June of 1981 at 20%. So right now we're at 0.25%. That's the target rate, the upper limit. We're at 0.25%, and Powell's saying, I'm not changing it. 0.25%. Volcker took it to 20%. That caused short-term pain. Okay, when you hike interest rates up that quickly, that dramatically, unemployment, look at the unemployment rate, went up, hit double digits. You saw this chart earlier, the T-bill. Oh, look at what was that? Oh, look at that, 1980. The yield on a Treasury 10-year bill, above 15%, so it became very, very expensive for the federal government to borrow. So you'd have to, so that's another consequence. These deficits would get really expensive, which, by the way, is it's a little alarming when you think of the fact that we have, not only do we have all this debt, but we have all these unfunded liabilities like Social Security. Right now there are $22 trillion in unfunded Social Security liabilities, $22 trillion, and for Medicare, $33 trillion. $22 trillion, $33 trillion. That's $55 trillion between the two. Yeah, if interest rates are super low, then you can get by with that. But if interest rates are even a little bit higher, like at this level, how do you keep those programs afloat? The interest payments that the government's going to have to pay on its debt, it will just be off the charts, or they're going to have to massively increase taxes because they can't borrow money cheaply. I'm telling y'all, man, like I'd say I don't mean to be alarmist, but you have to be a realist too. So when Volcker hiked up the federal funds rate, which is so higher than we can possibly imagine, in our own day, we're just not used to that. Unemployment went up. Market yield on Treasury securities went through the roof. There were protests in Washington by like farmers. The construction industry was like slammed. The farming industry was, the industrial sector as well were suffering greatly because they were so dependent on credit. Industrial sector, financial sector, construction sector. Credit. They need credit. And with interest rates this high, they couldn't do it. They couldn't make it in that kind of economy. The automotive industry shed hundreds of thousands of jobs. It was hard. It was a difficult move. But what happened? Look at that inflation rate. Went down by 1983. Remember when I said that the Social Security cost of living adjustment hasn't been this high since 1983? I was born in 1984. I was born in the post-inflation era, or post-bad inflation. There's a lot, the Fed's like, oh, we need 2%. But again, that's a rapid fall. But it took drastic measures, okay? It took drastic measures. By the way, the unemployment rate also fell. So that when Reagan ran for president in 1984, he just wiped the floor he ran against Walter Mondale. It was like one of the biggest landslides in history, because it was like a sigh of relief, like, whoa, we survived this really scary moment from the 70s, in the early 80s. And then eventually the Fed lowered its interest rate. It didn't have to stay here forever. It was needed. It was necessary to stop the bleeding, stop further devaluation. If Volcker didn't do this, it could have, who knows what could have happened to the dollar if Volcker didn't do that. But he did it. Fed lowered rates again. I mean, it's still, you're looking at here in the mid 80s, you're still at about 10%, which, again, just we haven't experienced anything remotely close to that. This is the historic standard. Again, have an appreciation for the exceptionality of the time in which you're living in. The exceptional, extraordinarily low interest rates, money supply, all of it. This is all uncharted territory. To give you an example of what higher interest rates, which is needed to stop this crisis, ultimately, it will have to be done. What this does, I mean, unless you're down with dollar devaluation, if you want to stabilize the currency, you're going to have to do something along these lines. As things begin, I don't think we need to go 20% right now, but it needs to be raised. And if things begin to spiral, you better do something big, but it's going to have a painful impact. Look at, so if you were to buy a $300,000 house and you secured a low interest rate, this is a low interest rate, 3.8%. Your monthly payment with an interest rate of 3.8% is $1,400. That's within the reach of a lot of most middle-income Americans, even lower middle-income Americans. You take that interest rate to 16%. And by the way, talk to a baby boomer and ask them about the housing market in the in the early 1980s. And buying a house, it was that your mortgage was extremely expensive because money was tight. I remember back in the 90s, my parents kept refinancing because interest rates were were reduced from what they were in the mid to early 80s. So you would refinance. But if interest rates were to go up to 16%, this is why you don't want an adjustable rate mortgage, then your monthly payment is going to be $3,500. Okay? So you see the real world impact. So now, if we look at safe haven commodities here, gold just hasn't really been, moving. Historically, gold rises as inflation fears go up. Same with silver. Silver is just not really moving. Now, as inflation ramps up, gold and silver will go up in price. Okay, I know some of my viewers here are big silver guys. I like silver too. Silver is going to go up. Silver will go up, but I think what we're witnessing here is very, very interesting. Bitcoin and crypto is soaking up a lot of what otherwise would have gone into gold and silver. Bitcoin's becoming the inflation hedge, the safe haven. Bitcoin is up from last October, is up 33%. Now, it was a bit of a volatile year. Went down to $30,000, but we're at $62,000 now. It was up 33%. Ethereum's like nuts, man. Ethereum's up almost 1,000%. Like Ethereum, Bitcoin and Ethereum are here to stay. You got the lesser coins, that is a lot more speculative. Bitcoin and Ethereum are the new safe haven assets that people will flock to as inflation gets worse. Bitcoin is going to go up. Bitcoin's here to stay. I don't know about the immediate movements. Obviously, I don't know this about immediate movements, but I'm thinking long term here. Bitcoin and Ethereum are very safe assets. Now, gold and silver will always have value. They've had value for thousands and thousands of years. So you could think of gold and silver as like the ultra safe asset, if you want like an ultra safe haven asset that will undoubtedly secure your wealth. But Bitcoin and Ethereum are becoming, especially Bitcoin and Ethereum. I think Bitcoin's already reached this point, but Ethereum is rapidly approaching that too, becoming sort of the new safe haven asset, and there's a possibility of greater returns on this asset than there would be for gold and silver. But all four of these assets will increase in price as inflation goes up, but the Bitcoin and the Ethereum are, I don't think if you're in for a long game, now I'm not talking about day-to-day speculation, if you're in for a long game, it's not a bad investment. in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, Carl Icahn, you remember that it's all Bitcoin's potential. If inflation spirals, if it becomes rampant, Bitcoin is going to really rise, and so will Ethereum. So now's not a bad time to buy. You might look at this and be like, "Oh man, Ethereum's $4,200. I could have bought it at 1,000." Well, you didn't, but now's not a bad time to buy. Okay, I don't give financial advice, but that's just, I think, if you're going for the long game, Bitcoin and Ethereum are good buys, and I think silver and gold are steady. They're solid assets that will also weather an inflationary storm. Rand Paul just the other day said crypto could become the reserve currency of the world if more people lose trust in government, and that's a big statement. Boy, if Bitcoin ever started becoming a reserve currency, that's going to be in the millions of dollars each. Okay, I mean that would be a huge move for Bitcoin. Now we're far off from that. That's more in the distant future, what Paul's talking about here. But he's right that crypto has that potential, especially a Bitcoin or Ethereum. It could be maybe a basket of different cryptocurrencies. It's probably more likely than just a single one. And that brings us to our last section here, Part D, World Reserve Currency. And this is the one I think that should really concern Americans, and the Americans need to think about. So Part B, Part A through C dealt more with the short term, like what's happening in the next couple years. What should we do? Part C was what should we do in the next couple years if inflation gets worse? Part D is the long-term prospects for the dollar. Because right now the U.S. dollar is the predominant world reserve currency. World reserve currency. Now, what does that mean? A reserve currency is a currency first as commonly held by central banks in other countries. So outside the Federal Reserve, other central banks, other countries, and they hold dollars. In this case, dollars, or whatever the reserve currency is. They hold that reserve currency in order to strengthen their own currency, in order to manage the foreign exchange rate of their currency, in order to cover trade deficits. So if like Spain has a trade deficit, they can balance that deficit with dollars. It can buy, dollars can be used to manage that deficit. Additionally, reserve currencies are frequently used in international global transactions, global investments, all aspects of the world economy. A world reserve currency is typically seen as a safe haven currency. A safe haven currency. Now, the dollar is not the only reserve currency at this moment. There are others. We'll see that in a moment. Nor is it the only world reserve currency in history. There have been many reserve currencies throughout history. The Roman denarius, Byzantine coinage, the Arab dinar was held in places all over the world. The florin in Renaissance Florence was held in all sorts of different countries in Europe. The Spanish piece of 8, which I talk about in depth in my History of Money course, you could appropriately call it a world reserve currency of sorts. The Dutch lion dollars, the guilders, and then in the 18th century up through the early 20th century, the main world reserve currency was the British pound. Here's an old British sovereign, the Bank of England note. The British pound was the predominant world reserve currency. The franc and the German mark also were held as reserve currencies, but it was all about the pound. And World War II happened, and since World War II, the U.S. dollar has been a predominant world reserve currency. There's a U.S. dollar, $100 bill from 1950, $100 bill from 2009. Now, here's like I said, the U.S. dollar is not the only reserve currency around the world. The euro. Today, the U.S. dollar makes up 59% of reserves held by central banks. The euro makes up 21%. Here's another graph, might be easier to make out. This one's a little more updated too. It goes through 2021. Euro makes up 21%, Japanese yen 6% of world reserves, pound sterling is 5%, the renminbi is just 3%, but a few years ago it was 0, so that's been a slight move for the Chinese state and financial system. And so this is foreign central bank and monetary authority reserves. And then also just internationally it's used. This is an index compiled by the Federal Reserve. This graph is from the Federal Reserve's website showing the percentage. It's an index of all sorts of different international transactions and the currency usage in those transactions. And the US dollar makes up like 70%, 60 to 70%. That's a huge advantage for a dollar. It's the predominant world reserve currency. You can see the euro's pretty good there too. About a quarter of all international global transactions use the euro, and then you have under that now the dollar became the world reserve currency in 1944 with Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods system, all major currencies were pegged to the dollar because the dollar was convertible into gold at $35 an ounce of gold. So that was the backing. Oops, I need to plug in my computer here. Battery is running low. See, I go too long. I'm not even on Twitter. I don't mess with that. How many characters do they allow? Like, I can't deal. I need like long form. Like I'll give y'all full length lectures here. All right, like if you're okay, if you like full length lectures, this is the place to be. Okay, and my computer's battery is going to run low a little bit toward the end if I don't have it plugged in. So this is where the dollar was pegged. That's what. Okay, and that was the Bretton Woods system. Now, as the dollar inflated in the 50s and 60s, it was clear that was untenable. Foreign central banks began demanding gold for their dollars, and so in 1971, Nixon said, "Nope, we're ending the gold window," closed the gold window, suspended convertibility into gold, and then it was officially removed. So there's no gold link anymore. No gold link. It's a full faith. It's a fiat currency. So a fiat currency is dangerous because you can go wild with it, and there's no anchor. I've done these videos about unanchored capitalism. That's what we have in our country. We have an unanchored economy. Our currency does not have an anchor. It relies on the full faith and credit of the United States government. And things like oil. So one of the ways that the U.S. dollar the dollar remained the world reserve currency even after 1971. One of the reasons for that is the U.S. government made a deal with Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC countries that oil would be priced in U.S. dollars. So other countries, if they want to buy oil, they need to have dollars to buy that oil. And oil is the most important commodity in the world. So oil is linked to the dollar. The petrodollar. That's what people call that. But this is the state of the dollar since, and this only goes to 2017. It's worse now. But the state of the dollar since 1970, since going off the gold standard. And we've got fiat currency, it's dependent on the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. And since 1982, so this is post 1970s inflation. Since 1982, there's been an almost 200 increase in the CPI. So dollars remain the world's reserve currency, but the value of the dollar has declined very steeply. This is a chart I made up for my History of Money course. Purchasing power of the U.S. dollar, if you use 1945 when Bretton Woods went into effect, if you use that as the base, something that a dollar could buy in 1945 now requires $15.24. That's a major decline in the purchasing power of the dollar. Or if you want to go, if you just compare it to 1970, something that could cost an item that you only needed $2 and 3 nickels to buy in 1970, you now need over $15. or look at since 1980. Okay, that's real inflation. Since 2000, we looked at those stats earlier in the video. That's real. That is devaluation. So the question is, how long can this persist, and how long can the dollar remain the world's reserve currency? Will it be a safe haven? World reserve currency has to be a safe haven asset. Can the dollar realistically be considered a safe haven asset? In 2008, it was. When Lehman Brothers went under, collapsed in September 2008, investors flocked to the dollar. They went to the dollar. Would a similar crisis cause, today, would investors respond today in a similar crisis by flocking to the dollar? The dollar is less stable than it was in 2008. In 2008, people say, "Oh, this is safe haven currency. The dollar, it's liquid, it's secure. The U.S. government always honors its obligations and it has the economic capacity to do so." Now, I said earlier in this video, the one thing the U.S. government has going for it is our share of world GDP is 25%. We've got a huge economy. We've got a very powerful military. But the dollar as world reserve currency, what that has done, it's given us a lot of benefits that we take for granted. Again, normalcy bias. What are those benefits? Dollar as world reserve currency has allowed the U.S. to run high trade deficits. And the reason why we can run high trade deficits is because we can import goods with our own currency. We can purchase imports with our own currency, and so we don't face a balance of payments crisis like other countries might and often do. The U.S. government can borrow at lower costs with its currency. There's a high demand for dollars all around the world. U.S. Treasury securities, there's an appetite for U.S. Treasuries all over the world because the U.S. is still largely trusted. But if all of a sudden the value of the dollar in foreign exchange markets begins to fall, and if all of a sudden this begins to drop, even just like 10 or 20 or 30%, And if all of a sudden, by the way, a lot of people don't know this, but 40% of Federal Reserve notes, like the physical banknote, like the physical Federal Reserve note, 40% of Federal Reserve banknotes are held by foreigners outside the United States. A lot of people don't know that. Why? Well, they want dollars. They use dollars to buy things. If that goes away, or if that is reduced in a meaningful way, that has a real impact on foreign exchange, on the dollar's value in international markets. If central banks begin to move away from the dollar, and this lowers a bit, maybe to the euro's level, that will have a real impact on the dollar's value overseas and on demand for the dollar. If the dollar loses its reserve currency status, financing deficits, trade deficits, will be a lot more expensive. Imported goods, the price of imported goods, which I don't know if you've been on Amazon lately, but how many goods on Amazon are imported from outside the United States? Price of imported goods would rise in real terms. Would rise because your dollar would no longer have the value it once did in foreign markets. Financing government deficits would become more expensive. Okay, it has big consequences that people again don't appreciate. So, that's all I've got to say. I want the dollar to be saved. Obviously, like this isn't if things began to spin out of control, you could have not just bad economic consequences, you could have really bad political consequences as people become more and more agitated, frustrated, angered. I think you could see a lot of people on the left become more and more hard left, I think, and start drawing more and more toward socialism, if not in some more radical centers, communism. And then on the right, I think you could see among younger people a push toward the hard right And I think the polarization, if you think it's extreme now, and it is, in imagine the political conflict, the political warfare in a country with double-digit inflation, or a country with inflation even worse than that. Now, they get hyperinflation. That's a high rate. Hyperinflation, economists define as 50% a month. Okay, when I say double-digit inflation, I mean over a year. 50% a month, which amounts to like over 1,000% over a year. If that's extreme, not impossible, but it's quite extreme. But imagine an economy where inflation is spiraling with this polarization. Do you think polarization would get we'd find common cause? All right, guys, let's come together and solve this. No, I don't think that's. I don't think that would be the result. So look, we're wrestling with a lot here, and I hope and pray that we can. I hope and pray that I can make a video a year from now and explain how I was wrong, or try to make sense of it. But I don't see this getting better anytime soon, barring something big action, and even then, that big action will have major consequences. Hey, y'all, buy my book. Buy my book, Currency of Empire. It's only $20. Well, excuse me, $19.95. Buy the book. Hey, got a good response. I think y'all helped drive the sales, because in July of this last July, Cornell came out with its list of the top 10 bestsellers in its entire catalog. And Cornell doesn't just do history; they publish a lot. They had a top 10 list of the top 10 bestsellers in the month of July, and we were number 2, baby, number 2. So I saw, I was like, it's my YouTube gang here. So anyway, buy a book if you haven't already. Thanks for your support. I'll try to come a little more frequently. I know it's been a little infrequent. I got a lot of things going on, but of you all, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.